To stay informed about new videos, you can subscribe to my channel and support me by liking the videos. Enjoy listening. Hello, I'm Mehmet, and I live in a small village in the Devilite district of Kayseri with my parents and two sisters. I can say we have a beautiful life. As a family, we were involved in animal husbandry about 25 years ago. At that time, I was 11 years old, Sumay, one of my sisters, was 9, and Merv was 4. Although we were quite young, in our time, these ages were not considered too young. We were running around doing various tasks. Our house was on the side of a mountain, and underneath, there was a cave-like stable. We took care of our animals here. The entrance of the stable was circular, and a makeshift wall, resembling a barrier made of wooden planks, zinc, and nylon, was built in front. They had constructed it with the means they had. During the winter, as it was very cold, my father used to light a stove inside. Therefore, one side of the stable was filled with logs and bushes. In winter, my father would place a bed at the entrance of the stable and sleep there. Since winter days were harsh, wild animals would come down to the village and enter the stable. As the door of the stable was not very sturdy, it wasn't difficult for them to enter. No matter how well we fortified it, they always managed to get in. If they killed one, it wasn't a problem. My father would slaughter and dispose of all of them. One winter day, during one of those harsh days, my father said to me, "All right, Mehmet, this year you should stay in the stable with me. There's a school break, and you're not at school. You'll get used to it, you'll take on this duty in the future." I was happy to spend time with my father, so I said, "Okay, Dad." After having dinner, my father and I went down to the stable. We laid out the beds we had previously brought on the tarpaulins. My father said, "Now it's time to light the stove and warm up." While I was getting the logs, my father took a sack full of bushes, stuffed the stove with them, and lit it. He threw a few of the logs I brought into it and set them on fire again. Since there were bushes in the stove, it caught fire quickly. Suddenly, a scream echoed. It was very sharp, a terrifying and painful scream that scratched the ears. This scream lasted for a few seconds and then stopped. The animals were wrestling among themselves due to this sound, and when it stopped, they also stopped. They were also uneasy, and my father took a few steps back from the stove, startled. When I asked what the sound was, my father said it was probably a mouse in the sack and that the animal had died. However, he didn't believe it himself because such a scream couldn't come from a mouse. Saying it was time to sleep, my father lay down. After a while, he turned to the stove, said, "May Allah grant comfort," and began to doze off. I lay down too, but I was still thinking about the sound. I was trembling in a strange way, not from the cold but from fear. The sound had somehow engraved itself into me, and around 10 minutes later, I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rattling. Since I had fallen asleep with fear, I opened my eyes, thinking, wolves are coming, and had to be alert because they might enter. Since the door of the barn wasn't very solid, animals could easily get in from underneath or above. I needed to wake my father. He knew well what to do. As I got up to wake him, I noticed that the sound was coming not from outside the barn but from inside. The barn door was makeshift, and animals could enter from underneath or above. My father knew what to do, and I needed to wake him up. As I was about to wake him, I noticed that the sound was not coming from outside but from inside the barn. As the barn door was not very solid, animals could easily enter from underneath or above. My father knew well what to do, so I got up to wake him. In the meantime, I realized that the sound was coming from inside the barn. Sheep's bells rubbing against something might have been the cause, I thought, and lay back down, but the sound was increasing. It turned into an unbearable noise, as if a metal piece was rubbing against glass. I covered my ears, lying still, and only the light from the stove's hole illuminated the barn dimly. I looked at the light, and a shapeless, strange shadow took different forms with the light. As I glanced at these shapes, a scream filled the room. While the sound decreased, I saw the embers falling from the stove and the stove moving slightly. Suddenly, my father jumped up, said, "In the name of Allah," and threw the falling embers into the stove. Neither the sound or the shadow disappeared abruptly. My mother and siblings asked what happened with curiosity, but I couldn't say anything. They didn't insist on asking what happened because they were afraid of my father. That day passed like this, I can say. In the evening of the same day, my father and I prepared to go to the barn to sleep again. My father threw a few logs into the stove and lit them. After a while, when it warmed up inside, we went to our beds and lay down. While sleeping, I had the same dream again. "Oh God, protect us, Julia's sister, you burned it, you killed it," she was screaming, accusing, and tearing herself apart, saying, "What will I say to her now?" Trying to get rid of Julia's sister, when suddenly a shapeless black shadow appeared in front of me. Undulating in front of me, yelling, "You will pay for this." I woke up by jumping suddenly. I was trembling, and my heart was beating very fast. Since our beds with my father were side by side, I tried to move around a bit to tease my father. When I did that, my father turned to me and said, "Don't toss, my son, sleep." When my father said that, I returned to my place and started waiting, looking at the stove. Every time I closed my eyes, Julia's sister came to my mind. So I started waiting without blinking my eyes. When the call to prayer started, my father got up, performed ablution, and while cleaning his nose with water during ablution, he made strange sounds. I used to laugh at that sound. But today I didn't laugh, I was suppressing my feelings of fear. My father prayed. After a while, the sky brightened. As soon as it brightened, I began to get ready to leave. I wanted to get out of the barn as soon as possible. Just as I was about to leave the barn, Julia's sister was watching us from behind the wall of their house. My father greeted, "Good morning, Julia's sister," but she didn't respond. After my father mumbled, "I hope everything is fine," my father said, "Go and get the buckets, I will milk the animals." After getting the buckets, milking the animals, and completing our morning routine, we had breakfast. I couldn't tell my family about my dream. Even if I did, they wouldn't believe me. I didn't want to sleep in the barn again at night. Since I slept there, I experienced strange dreams and events. Near evening, I timidly asked my father if I could sleep elsewhere today. He asked why, and I said, "I'm cold, I can't sleep." He said, "Okay, let's see." That night, my father slept in the barn, while my siblings, my mother, and I slept at home. I woke up in the morning with the call to prayer. I waited while staring at the ceiling with my eyes open for a while. I was waiting to hear my father's voice, but there was no sound. If my father woke up, I would surely hear his voice while he performed ablution. I was accustomed to the sounds because I heard the same things every day. I waited a few more minutes, but there was no sound. I wondered if my father fell asleep. While thinking about it, my mother woke up, performed ablution, and prayed. When my mother finished her prayer, I said to her, "Dad hasn't woken up, his voice is not coming. Should we check?" My mother replied, "Have you ever seen your father get up for prayer? Maybe he didn't make any noise." Without saying anything, I pulled the blanket over me. Still, there was no sound. I was very curious, so I couldn't stand it and went downstairs. As I approached the door, I heard rustling from inside and the sounds my father was struggling to make. I opened the door slightly and looked inside. My father was struggling, trying to scream, but it seemed like he couldn't open his lips. I shouted, "Dad!" Meryl, my mother, had followed me. My mother recited the basmala, and my father suddenly woke up, jumping out of bed, covered in cold sweat. We reached him. My mother was still reciting prayers, and my father was trembling. My father said, "Don't be afraid, my son." I couldn't get up for prayer, and nightmares came to disturb my sleep. Then, my mother wiped the sweat on my father's forehead with her headscarf, looked into his eyes, and asked, "Are you okay?" Julia's sister didn't respond. Instead, she continued staring at us with an intense gaze. My father, now more concerned, repeated his question. "What are you doing there, Julia's sister?" Again, there was no response. The atmosphere became increasingly eerie as we observed Julia standing there, unmoving. My father, growing uneasy, decided to approach her cautiously. As he got closer, he asked once more, "Julia's sister, is everything all right?" Still, there was no acknowledgement. Suddenly, Julia started speaking, but her voice was different, deep and unsettling. She uttered, "You shouldn't have come here. The shadows are watching, and the flames are hungry." Her words sent shivers down our spines. My father, trying to maintain composure, asked, "What do you mean, Julia's sister? What shadows? What flames?" Julia's eyes, now devoid of their usual warmth, glowed with an otherworldly intensity. She spoke again, this time in a more urgent tone, "Leave this place before it's too late. The shadows feed on fear, and the flames consume the unwary. You're in danger." Julia's eyes, now devoid of their usual warmth, glowed with an otherworldly intensity. She spoke again, this time in a more urgent tone, "Leave this place before it's too late. The shadows feed on fear, and the flames consume the unwary. You're in danger." Fear gripped us, and my father, deciding not to press further, took a step back. Julia's demeanor became increasingly disturbing, and we heeded her warning. Slowly backing away, we left the vicinity of the abandoned structure. The encounter with Julia left us unsettled, and the mysteries surrounding the strange occurrences deepened. Despite our unease, we continued our journey to seek guidance from Dermis Hoka, hoping to unravel the mysteries that now surrounded us. The suspense and the mysterious events in the village kept us on edge. My father, trying to make sense of it all, shared a concerned look with me as we navigated through the perplexing circumstances. Dermis Hoka's involvement and the amulet he provided added an air of mystique to the situation. My father's earnest commitment to following the Hoka's advice and ensuring we kept the amulets on heightened my awareness of the gravity of the situation. The encounter with Julia's sister near the abandoned structure had intensified our unease, making the journey back home feel like a delicate dance between reality and the unknown. Emin Ant's uncanny ability to sense our presence without sight added another layer to the enigma. The question of how she knew we had arrived lingered in the air, echoing the mysterious nature of the unfolding events. As we settled back into our home, a sense of trepidation hung in the air, overshadowing the mundane aspects of daily life. The village, once a familiar and comforting place, had transformed into a realm of uncertainty. Each encounter, each revelation, only deepened the sense of foreboding, leaving us to grapple with the unsettling reality that something beyond our understanding was at play. The journey ahead seemed fraught with challenges, and the mysterious occurrences hinted at a tale that was far from over. My father, "Those who are blind have a strong sixth sense. He must have sensed it," he said. Days and weeks passed, and spring arrived. On a Saturday, my father, along with my mother and my middle sister, took the sheep and lambs to the meadow below the village. Green grass covered everything, and the cold weather was gone. I was given the task of looking after my younger sister, Merv. We were playing with a ball in the garden when Emin Ant shouted, "Don't ever enter there." Somehow, I found myself in front of the barn door, holding Merv's hand. But how? Emin Aunt couldn't see, so how did she know we entered there? She collapsed in her yard, and neighbors who heard her rushed to her side. She was lying on the ground, barely dressed, without proper clothing or even socks and slippers. The neighbors picked her up and took her home. Merv and I ran back to the house, waiting for our parents, not knowing what had happened. We didn't move from our spots. Our family returned home after a while, and I explained what had occurred. My father immediately asked, "Where is the talisman?" I replied, "I think I forgot to put it back on after taking a bath." He urgently told me to find it and put it on, emphasizing not to take it off again. The news had reached Dermis Hoka by then. The next day, he came to our house and asked us to explain the situation. My father narrated the events, and the Hoka, turning to me, asked why I went to the barn door. I confessed that I didn't know how I got there and why I went. I snapped out of it when Emin Aunt shouted. The Hoka seemed to understand the situation and warned me not to remove the talisman from my neck. He then looked at the wall, where the Quran was hanging, and asked my father if they continued with their prayers. My father, nodding, said, "Alhamdulillah, Hoka." My mother also nodded in agreement. Dermis Hoka said, "Let me recite some prayers in a house where Allah is worshipped, and then I will take my leave." After reciting some prayers, he left the house. They called him to another house. And after praying there as well, he left. It was already dark by then. A few days after the Hoka left, my father ran into him. That evening, on his way back home, he witnessed an incident and later recounted it to us. According to the Hoka's account, as he was passing by the abandoned building on his way from our village to his own, he noticed sounds and lights emanating from inside the building. Curious, he approached and saw Julia. There was an empty cradle beside her, a fire burning in the center, and swirling black smoke surrounded the fire. Constantly asking, where, he questioned Julia. However, she was crying and not responding, she was just waiting. The Hoka decided to leave without intervening. That was what my father recounted. In those days, strange events continued to haunt us. One day, flames started to rise from the haystack next to our house. As we rushed downstairs to extinguish the fire, we suddenly turned around, and the flames were gone. It was as if nothing had burned. There were no sparks left from the flames that had just erupted. We were bewildered, quickly went back upstairs, and the fire had started again. As we ran downstairs and grabbed the buckets, the fire disappeared once more. The fire visible when going up was invisible when going down. It was vanishing, and we began to feel scared. My mother couldn't sleep, she stayed up all night praying and reading the Quran. Julia's sister, who roamed around our house, stared at us angrily but never spoke. My mother didn't approach them either. Toward summer, all the neighbors gathered in front of Emin Aunt's house. My mother asked, "What happened, neighbors?" They said, "Emin Aunt passed away, didn't you hear?" I started crying, saying, "Poor woman, she was a very good person." We were very saddened, but Julia's sister, sitting outside as if she hadn't been affected at all, stared into space without expression. When her other children came from the city, they buried her. After everyone left, Julia's sister was left alone. My father was considering selling everything, including the sheep, and leaving the village. One evening, as my parents were discussing this, stones began to be thrown at our house. And the windows were breaking. The windows were shattered. We hid behind the couch and saved ourselves. Meanwhile, screams were coming from Julia's sister's house. My father took the opportunity to look downstairs and said, "No one is there, be sure not to leave your places." Taking the Quran hanging on the wall, he went downstairs. The frames on the walls of the house were all shattered. My mother shouted for us to come downstairs, and when we did, we saw my father entering Julia's sister's house. Our own house was almost collapsing. After my father, we entered Julia's sister's house, where there was hardly any furniture. There was an empty cradle in the center, and around the cradle were clusters of feathers and pieces of intestines, evil eye beads, and blood stains on the wall. I had entered this house a few times before, but I had never seen such a scene. I couldn't believe my eyes. It had turned into a horrifying place. Julia's sister was lying on the ground, covered in blood. People started entering the house at that moment. Everyone was shocked when they saw the scene. They were saying, "There's something wrong with this girl." After a few minutes of shock, my father, running out of the door, asked, "What happened to our house?" Suddenly, the house collapsed with a loud noise. The animals in the barn scattered, and most of them were dead. We were all in shock. Our neighbors couldn't understand what happened, but we had an idea. My father quickly took us and brought us to the city, then to Ankara, with the help of relatives. He found a job and settled us in a new home. Years passed. As I began to understand things, my father sat me down to tell me the story. The information he got from Dermis Hoka was as follows: that night in the barn, when we threw the logs into the stove along with the twigs, it marked the beginning of a series of events filled with mysteries. As for Julia's sister, she was a complete enigma. In her youth, she fell in love with someone, but the person she loved was in love with someone else. Julia's sister sought help from a traveling salesman who dealt with such things to make the guy fall in love with her. One night, the traveling salesman told her to come to the abandoned building at the village's exit, saying he would explain what she needed to do there. When Julia's sister went to the abandoned building, the traveling salesman prepared a spell for her, but the spell backfired, and the salesman's neck was broken on the spot, and he died. After that day, Julia's sister became possessed. No one proposed to her, and she had a relationship with the entity that possessed her until a baby from the fire jinn lineage was born. No one was aware of anything until the baby was born. Julia's sister used our barn to hide the baby from her mother. Without us knowing, we probably threw the baby into the stove along with the firewood. I don't know if it was in the sack, among the children, or in the stove, but that's how they haunted us. The entity that was cursed took revenge on both us and Julia's sister. Years later, my father and Dermis Hoka crossed paths. Dermis Hoka said, "Thank God you prayed and worshipped. The Quran was near you, otherwise, the fire jinn would not have left you alone. It would have destroyed your family," he said. After we left the village, no one dared to approach the houses of both us and Julia's sister. Occasionally, they hear lullabies and baby cries from there at night, and some nights, they claim to have seen Julia's sister. That's the end of the story, my friends. Thank you for listening. I love you all. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, you can subscribe and turn on notifications to be informed about the upcoming stories. See you in the new videos. Goodbye.